James Ernest of the Growing Truth here with Chris Dempsey, author of No Boston Olympics, How and Why Smart Cities Are Passing on the Torch. So, who originally initiated the book idea? Was it more you or Andrew?
Actually, we decided to write the book while we were sitting in a bar at a hotel in Hamburg, Germany, of all places. But the reason that we were there is because Hamburg, Germany was also considering a bid for the 2024 Olympics. And opponents and skeptics of the bid in Hamburg invited us over to tell the story of what happened in Boston. And as we realized that people in Hamburg were interested in the Boston story, we figured that there might be people in other cities that were also interested. So that's where we decided to sort of formally put pen to paper and make sure that the story of the downfall of Boston 2024 was something that was accessible to anyone that wanted to read about it.
Excellent. So if there are other cities that wanted to do the same thing, kind of a blueprint of how to go about doing that, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, every city is unique and every city has their own reasons to bid or not to bid on a games, but I think it's important to tell that story, to show that there are a lot of flaws in the main talking points of Olympic boosters, and to provide some tips on how citizens might oppose a bid if one is proposed for their town.
Excellent. Did his son Jeff ever consider doing a documentary about the movement?
Yeah. You know, I'm not sure. I haven't talked to him about that, but I know that Andy's very proud of the work that his son's doing in documentary films, so maybe there's an opportunity there.
If you had the choice between the Olympics and the World Cup, obviously, I know you're not a fan of having the Olympics. Would you consider having the World Cup there?
Well, I think the World Cup is a very different event in a lot of ways. You have to remember that the World Cup, you bid on it by country, not by city. And so if the U.S. were to bid on a World Cup, and if Foxborough Stadium, for example, Gillette Stadium in Foxborough, Massachusetts, were positioned for a few games, I think there'd be no problem with that at all. That's a short-term event. It doesn't involve a lot of construction, doesn't involve any taxpayer guaretees similar to what the International Olympic Committee requires of host cities. So they have a very different risk profile and cost profile. And you know what? Boston has actually hosted World Cup events before, back in 1994, and I don't see any reason why Greater Boston couldn't do the same thing if there were a World Cup in the U.S.
Nice. Tell us about some of the cameos in the book, some of the big names that we would know that were a part of this whole thing.
Well, it's interesting because Boston 2024 really pulled on a lot of local and national celebrities to boost the bid. Those are names like Larry Bird and David Ortiz and Meb Keflezighi, the Boston Marathon winner and Olympian. So some of the biggest athletes that Boston has ever known were nominally supportive of the bid. I think something that's interesting and is sort of insightful as to how Olympic bids work is that David Ortiz actually didn't even know that he was officially a supporter of the bid. The deal had been worked out between Poppy's agent and the Boston 2024 committee. And so later on, when a reporter asked him about it, it became clear that Ortiz actually didn't even know that he had been a part of the bid. So it's just, again, representative of sort of how the Olympics work. It's a lot of marketing and facade, but without a lot of substance.
Oh, wow. I mean, not even, I mean, I get it if, you signed up for a shoe company and they might not have told you right away, or you're, selling a brand of hot dogs or whatever, but yeah, they didn't even tell him that, that he was responsible for trying to get to the Olympics. In
fact, he didn't even know that Boston was bidding on the Olympics. So first he had to clarify that with the reporter, and then he admitted that he had no idea that he was on Boston 2024's board of directors. So that just gives you a sense of sort of how the Olympics work.
Wow, that is dirty. And that makes more sense of why the phrase "hatched a plan" kept popping up in the literature, because I was kind of curious on that. I mean, because at first I was wondering, I mean, did they have the evil intentions, or was there some patriotism in it? They just wanted the Olympics.
Well, I think it's really important to first separate the idea of hosting the Olympics with any sort of idea around patriotism. I think those of us that were opposed to the games are very proud Americans that believe that that Boston has a really bright future. And what we wanted to make sure was that that bright future wasn't put at risk by being asked to write a multi-billion-dollar check that was only going to be put towards a 3-week event. And so that was really our challenge, and I think in fact it's consistent with a long history of Bostonians standing up for what they believed in and not being afraid to go up against some powerful forces, even if, on the other side. So I think that would be the first point. I think in terms of what the boosters behind Boston 2024 saw in it, I think there were certainly some on that side that were in it for the money, especially some of the consultants that Boston 2024 was paying. Boston 2024 spent about $15 million on the bid process.
Oh, my.
So there were a lot of people that did very well coming out of that. They had consultants that were getting paid tens of thousands of dollars a month each, and hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in some cases to consult on the bid and push the bid forward. And then I think some of the other folks that were behind it that were wealthy, they weren't in it for the money, but they were really in it for the exposure and the fact that it was going to allow them to take a starring role in the event and the process, and that's something that they really wanted to be a part of. So we certainly don't blame anyone on the other side that was for the Olympics and that was pushing it, but we felt it was a really bad idea for our city's future, and most Bostonians came around to our side and agreed with us.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, after the fact that they refused to share the details and all, what were some of the details that they did refuse to share originally?
Well, the United States Olympic Committee actually requires these bids to be kept private and for the details not to be shared with the public. And I think that the USOC should really do some soul searching to figure out what kind of organization it wants to be. It's really pretty pathetic, actually, that they ask cities and bidders to do that. And in this case, it really backfired because Bostonians really want to see the details of a plan. We're not afraid about digging our hands in and getting dirty with the details about what these bids or proposals might mean for our neighborhoods and for our communities. And because they kept it quiet, it only raised suspicion of what was in there. And in fact, as it turned out, they really were being intentionally deceitful on the bid. So the best example of that is that the bid that they showed the public, the documents they showed the public, showed that there was a balance between the revenues and the cost, essentially that the games would be break even. But they had a separate set of books that they were keeping private that showed that they actually were projecting a deficit for the Olympics. And so they were going out to the public and they were saying, well, break even or we might even make money. And in fact, their own set of books showed that they were going to lose money. And that was an intentional deception on their part to try to paper over the fact that this was a very risky proposal. And I think anyone involved in that process should be embarrassed to be associated with that.
Would you consider it similar to how pro sports teams want cities to finance their stadium, or because there's so many more things involved in this with the Olympics that there's multiple stadiums that aren't being used, consistently, or buildings would be completely different?
No, I think there's a lot of similarities. I mean, they definitely are different when you're talking about just building maybe one baseball stadium or one football stadium compared to the Olympics that requires building a stadium, a velodrome, which is an indoor cycling facility, aquatic center, an Olympic village that usually costs somewhere between $2 and $3 billion to house the athletes for a 3-week event. So there are differences, but fundamentally, there's a question here about whether governments should be spending money on sporting facilities. Look, I'm a proud Bostonian and a proud Boston sports fan. Follow all the major sports in Boston and grew up going to games at Fenway or games at the Garden. So, my pride as a Boston sports fan is up there with anyone else in this city. But that doesn't mean that we should be spending public tax dollars to finance stadiums and sporting facilities. We've got a great economy here and a really strong city, but we also have our challenges, and we should be focused on problems like transportation, education, healthcare. Those are some of the basics that people really want their elected officials to get right, not to have them distracted by sporting venues and sporting events. And look, if a business can't make it work, if Bob Kraft or the Patriots or the Jacobs family with the Bruins, if they can't make the business work, then that's too bad. But they shouldn't be looking to go to the taxpayers to sort of make up the difference for them. And I think that's true of Boston and true of cities around the world and around the country. I think they should really be very careful and skeptical of requests from owners of sports teams, many of whom are multi-billionaires, for taxpayer funds to support their buildings.
Earlier you mentioned how Boston has always been fighters and over, the achieving against odds. So the Boston Tea Party, Boston Red Sox, and you all, similarities, differences.
Well, look, I can't compare our group to those historical heroes or the more recent sports heroes. But I will say that the debate in Boston was very high profile. It was this great combination of talking about politics and sports and transportation and real estate development. So it had all these different components of things that people really like to talk about in Boston. And because it was a mix of all those things, it became kind of the dominant civic discussion in 2015. We were really helped by the fact that the media and journalists did a very good job of exposing some of Boston 2024's issues and really in their deceit throughout the process. So we benefited from that. And I think we really benefited from the fact that Bostonians like to engage in these debates. They like to be informed. And what we saw in the polling is that the more Bostonians learned about the Boston 2024 bid, the less they liked it. So initially they were very open to the idea. They were excited by it, but then they saw what the details meant. Basically, they read the fine print and they realized this was not a good deal. So if we helped accelerate that process or provide a voice to people that felt like this was a bad idea, then we were really happy to do that. But it certainly doesn't compare to any of our heroes of the past that did much greater things for our city.
Maybe a little Paul Revere, because you all started
exactly.
to spread the awareness, and I'm sure as he rode by, you tell one person, and that one person tells another person, and just kind of spreads awareness and education. So I could see some similarities there.
Yeah, that might be right. Yep.
Let's see. So who would you like to thank for their support and help during the event?
Well, there's a long list of folks that were part of our team. We had actually more contributions, more individual contributors to our process than Boston 2024 had. The difference was that Boston 2024 had an average contribution size north of $40,000, whereas our average contribution size was about $100. So we really had just regular Bostonians kind of coming together and helping us out, and that's really who deserves the most credit in this story. The many, many volunteers who maybe wrote a check for $20, or they came to some of our public meetings, or they wrote a letter to the editor of the Boston Globe or the Boston Herald. Those are the real heroes, and I think they deserve a lot of credit, and we try to give them a lot of credit in the book because they very much deserve it. It's a real story of regular people kind of coming together and fighting against some powerful interests.
What's your thoughts on, I heard a proposed plan out there where they either take 2 or 4 cities and the IOC, does a rotation every 4 years, kind of like how they do with the bowl games in college football, and those are just the 4 Olympic cities in the world. What do you think about something like that?
Well, I think something like that makes a lot of sense. I think you can even make the case that it should just be one permanent venue or permanent host, which would be fine. If you think about the Olympic business model, it really started in the 19th century. In 1896 was the first modern Olympic Games. And the model that they were taking there was the model of the World's Fair, which used to move around to different cities and provide cities an opportunity to sort of show off what they were all about. And since 1896, we've invented the radio, the television, the internet, we've invented this podcast, we've invented air travel. So it's a lot easier to get around now, and it's a lot easier to communicate and share stories and share images around the world than it was in 1896. And I think the case that it needs to move around is really lessened since then, and instead we should be thinking about, as you say, maybe a small number of permanent venues or maybe even one permanent venue. Just have that in place, and people around the world can still watch it on television, still make for great TV, and at the same time, if people want to go visit it in person, they can get on a plane. Whereas in 1896, they had to maybe take a 2-week trip by boat to get to kids to the Olympics, now they can get there in 24 hours, connecting through a major airport. So I think that we're far past the time of having it make sense to rotate these games around to different cities. The expense and the cost is just overwhelming for host cities, and we should be much more focused on just a couple locations.
Excellent. I agree with you 100%. I think that would be a nice way of doing it. Kind of like with the NFL for the longest time. If you wanted to see the Pro Bowl, you went to Hawaii, that kind of thing. And if they could, like you said, narrow it down to one, maybe two, for each hemisphere, or one for the winter and one for the summer, that would be great. Yeah, and then that would, like you said, severely cut down the cost and just make it that city's basically, you could build their economy around it, because then they're going to keep coming back each time.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Heck, you could even incorporate the athletes to go there and train instead of training wherever they happen to train now. They could actually kind of live there the year before and do their training. So, yeah, all kinds of good options instead of, like you said, them coming in and just draining the city's resources.
I think that's exactly right. And, the Olympics would still be just as special for the athletes and for the people that are watching in person or the people that are watching on TV. And we should really be bringing this back to those special sports moments and the athletes that have dedicated their lives to this. This should not be a competition around who has the best construction companies and who spent the most on a glittering Olympic village or a glittering stadium. It should be about what athletes put in the most effort and the most work and triumphed. And the only way to really do that would be to take it back to a model where you do have one location or a limited number of locations.
Excellent. Chris, I'd like to thank you for your time. Chris Dempsey was with us, author of No Boston Olympics, How and Why Smart Cities Are Passing on the Torch. Any final thoughts, Chris?
No, really appreciate you having me on, and I hope folks check out the book. I think they'll enjoy it. It's a great story of Boston, but also puts Boston in the context of all these other cities that have said no to the Olympics and realize that they have better and smarter things to do than being focused on a 3-week event.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. Have a good one.